Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to Dice and Mind, a monthly podcast in which we explore the meaning of life through the lens of RPGs.
We're lifelong friends, a couple of guys in their 40s who along the way had families and became professionals. Over the years, we've talked about pretty much everything. But recently, we realized we both had an interest and some history with tabletop role-playing games. So,
In each episode, we will consider everyday stuff like science, religion, philosophy, and economics, all through the lens of a specific role-playing game and its dice mechanic. For example, what would I have to roll in the Edge of the Empire narrative dice system to get that promotion at work?
or would getting that paper published give me advantage on a subsequent D20 roll in Dungeons & Dragons?
If I were DM, likely not. But join us now and every month to think deeply, geek out, and explore how RPGs make the world just a little bit better.
This is
Dice in Mind.
We'd like to thank all of you for continuing with us on our journey through D&D and FFG and Star Trek as a whole. We want to thank everyone for continuing to follow us out on social media. This last episode, we got into all things Trek. It was one of our longer episodes. It was a vast and all-encompassing episode regarding Star Trek and the universe. We're going to take a step in a different direction this week. A couple weeks back, at the time we've recorded here, I'd picked up from Drive-Thru RPG the printed editions that they have of AD&D First Edition. And one of the reasons behind doing that was I'd read some social media posts and articles about how the DM guide is poorly organized, is the term I've heard used, but it is still a must read for gamers and especially for DMs. So Jason and I were talking about this. He of his own accord picked up the DM guide. And as we talked through this, on the side, we realized that, well, this might make for a good episode in talking about first edition versus fifth edition and so on. Now, I know that there's been a lot of discussion out there. You can listen to a lot of educated people on other podcasts that I would listen to and Jace would listen to, talking about different areas of the game and different nuances. I know you could go into a second edition, you could go into hours talking about THAC-O and things like that. We want to narrow our focus this week, and we're going to talk about the gaming mechanic and the dice mechanic, and not necessarily, we might branch out a little bit, but not so much about the world itself, but kind of get back to the core of what the onus was for this podcast. And we want to talk about that mechanic and that world and gaming. So, Jason, I know that, now I really didn't do a lot of AD&D playing. Did a little bit in middle school, little bit in high school, never owned the books, just played. So I had a little experience. Jace didn't. So his exposure was really with picking up the DM guide. And since Jace, you've done a lot of reading on fifth edition, picking up the DM guide in the first edition was, that's really your first full exposure to that world that came out in 1977, 79, whatever. I think it was 77 before second edition came out about a decade later. So what were your initial thoughts as you started researching, and going through it? I'm curious. We talked about this a little, but you'll hear it a little organic, folks, because we didn't talk too deeply about our differences in opinion on that as such.
Yeah, it's a good question. Hi, listeners. Welcome back. Thanks for being here. It's a good question. Brad, we've been having so much fun recording this podcast and getting into these games and these worlds. And obviously, if you've all been listening with us, we obviously really went deep on Star Trek. I mean, we've had Star Trek on the brain for some time, but like Brad said, I've read I've read about the original D&D. I've read about AD&D, this first edition here. I've read books on Gygax. I've read like I recommend books like Dice. What was it? Dyson. Of Dyson Men. I'm sorry, guys. Of Dyson Men. Things like that. I was gonna say Dyson Mind. Catchy title. We should use that. Um. uh. So like tangentially third person, if you will. I've obviously you can't be involved with like 5e and not see some of the callbacks. But I had no exposure. And so when Brad started texting me of shockingly he was going to or had just ordered yet more RPG books, but in all seriousness, he started texting me that the originals were back in print through what Drive Through RPG, presumably a POD, a print on demand, and how they're supposed to be sort of remarkable thematically as like a time capsule. Uh, I listened, I thought about it, and I don't think it took honestly more than I was going to say a handful of days. And it was so inexpensive. I thought, okay, I'm going to just pick up the DM guide, which Brad assures me is supposed to be really remarkable. And it took a while to get here. And it was just really kind of fascinating to read the preface, to read like actually read the first pages, which is essentially Gary Gygax at that point with TSR introducing the concept and the world and the respective roles of the GM, or in his case DM, and the players. And I'll turn over to you, Brad, in a sec. I'll just close or transition with this, that what really stands out to me, because okay, let's provide our listeners a little context. We were both born in 74, which happens to be the birth year of role-playing games. And I think because of the luck of the draw, you were born, Brad, a few months before, and I was born a few months after. So this is like going to the original DM guide and the other books. It's a bit of a callback for us, like, oh right, that's how things were done before we had any gray hair. In full disclosure, I have substantially more than Brad, although he is significantly older in 1974. What really stands out for me is you can tell reading the DM guide that most of the players didn't know what the hell this was, right? Like today in 2021, you can talk to anyone who has any exposure to geekery and or nerdery. We can parse that later, and they've at least heard of role-playing games. Everyone, thanks to the Big Bang Theory and Critical Role and other things of Will Wheaton, everyone's heard of D&D, even if they don't have a clue what it is. But when this guy came out, you can see it was written, excuse me, for a bunch of players, and actually, I'll get to this later, a bunch of DMs who were total noobs. They didn't have any background beyond a desire in playing. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Brad.
No, I think you hit it on the head. That as I reread through, and I'm still not done yet, because it is a very, Jason, I think we said this before we recorded, a very crunchy read. You could obviously tell that they, Gygax and so on there was a lot of thought that was put into it. It was just they were processing as they were writing.
They were only one garage away from being a homebrew.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a and let's be honest, this is not a knock. This is the nature. You go back and look at, a TI computer versus, a handheld iPhone, it's night and day, and that's understandable. It's not like one is worse than the other. It's just, you go back in time when you read this material. I picked up the 3 core books and then the Unearthed Arcana, which I have not looked at, and I probably won't for a while. I just don't have time. You can tell that when DMs were sitting down with players, that it almost feels like, in a way, and I don't know if this was the intent or not, but almost more adversarial in many ways than what we might be used to now. Doesn't mean that the DM isn't there to throw wrenches in the works, and Jace has heard many a time me use the term DM prerogative to make things interesting, but
wherein interesting equals I'm going to hand you your posterior on a plate.
Yeah, and we could tell stories about Jason throwing hand axes and other things that have become their own little memes about within our group. But ultimately, it is going back, and we haven't dived in yet per se. And I don't know in the amount of time how deep we're going to be able to get into this, Jason. We might need to have another episode at some point talking about first edition. I just found it fascinating, just even down to the typeset and so on. The I don't want to say this in a negative way. The organization of the book was a work in progress at that point. I don't want to, I could, if I say it in a mean way, I don't mean it that way, but it was disorganized.
No, I remember our college days together working on the newspaper, right, with you being the editor. And I remember the layout boards, right? This was, I mean, yes, we had computers in college, but this is really pre-layout. And one of the things that struck me, Brad and I were talking about this before recording. One of the things that struck me is it's such a dense, chock full of detail book. And in the late 70s, they lacked any significant computing help to do this. I mean, you can tell that the typesetting, the layout, the font work, the organization, just Brad's not dissing this at all. The amount of respect I think we share for what they did in a manual like this, a DM guide, pre-PC. I mean, we're actually talking the actual PC, right? What they accomplished with this, you have to applaud it.
Well, and if I remember correctly, and I might have this wrong, and if I do, listeners, please let us know. I believe, if I remember correctly, the Monster Manual is my first one to come out. If you look at 5th edition, you could be a DM. You can DM a game and be a player with just one book, the Player's Handbook. The DM guide is good enrichment material. It's still worth a good read, but you could buy one book, and if you don't need a book, but if you were gonna purchase to get into D&D, you just need the player's guide for the most part. In 1st edition, that isn't the case. If you're the DM, you need the DM guide. If you're a player, you need the player's handbook. Because, if you go back, I can look on my shelf here and see the Pathfinder core rule book, right? So, and that they did have a separate, dungeon masters and game masters guides and so on. Pathfinder is very good at creating material. But here, when I read through the player's handbook originally, I'm like, okay, this is great. I have an understanding on how to play, but I have no idea how to lead a game. That's not what the material was for. They purposefully, it to me felt like they wanted to create this veil between the player and the DM.
So on that note, and we want to be respectful of copyright here. Let me just read the first sentence in a paragraph in the preface of this guide. As this book is the exclusive precinct of the DM, you must view any non-DM player possessing it as something less than worthy of an honorable death. That's not entirely the attitude of 5e.
No. I mean, obviously, I think you hit it on the head earlier. This was the early age of nerddom. So they weren't making this for mass market. You weren't seeing articles written about Vin Diesel or Stephen Colbert or other celebrities playing these games. This was, Gygax and others putting together material in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a little bit south of where both Jason and I hail, and building it in effect almost for themselves, and then going back and making it readable or potentially usable for other folks that were within, they felt were within their realm of knowledge and interest. It wasn't mass market. Let's be honest, mass market really came around more with Redbox D&D. And that became more popular than AD&D. It was more marketable. You could find it in the toy stores. That's how I got my first exposure. Is I got Dungeons and Dragons probably in 83. So I was like 9 or 10 years old. That was my first exposure to it. It wasn't advanced. I didn't even know what advanced was at that point. So, you know, I'm scatterbrained here in my thought just because the material is so, like you said, so dense.
Well, let me ask you a question on that note.
Mhm.
Okay, so we've kind of set up the tone for our listeners that it's clearly D&D, right? But the tone is much more antagonistic and in a playful way. And like you already said, it's definitely crunchier than 5e. So you spent considerably more time with 1e, both, you know, back in the day, as well as lately with all these reprints. Tell us your impression of the mechanic. Obviously it's a D20, but tell us your impression of the mechanic and how it feels, and if anything stands out, like the 1e mechanic specifically versus like the 5e or whatever.
Silence is thought here, listeners. From my perspective, I think we have seen this evolve over time, and I don't want to, because I've been reading a lot about this online. A lot of folks out there, listeners or not, have talked about the dice mechanic. You know, it was, you know, it's tons and tons of charts. It's almost, to me, there's like a slide rule feel to it. For those of you that are this, if not, Google slide rule, you'll understand. I think for me is when you look at the way you roll D20 now versus, you know, strength scores and so on, and you had max numbers of 18, and then you have percentile dice and so on. It's from my perspective, and again, I'm trying not to dive too deeply into it right this second, but it almost feels, Jace, like when we originally started talking about Pathfinder and getting something crunchy to satisfy our statistical itches that we have in our own ways. It almost feels like first edition is like a good compromise between 5th edition and Pathfinder for me. You know,
Oh, that's interesting.
You can, you know, it is a more complex, air quote, D20 system. There was much more emphasis placed on the DM, you know, hit adjustments, attack modifiers. It just, there was a lot of process that went into each of this. And you could tell as they went from doing their outdoor simulation fighting to an indoor paper-based game, it felt more like, and I like it this way, it felt a little calculus to me. Whereas Pathfinder went kind of back in that direction. You can kind of tell that way. I don't want to get too deep into that, but
well, I think just the fact that in the early pages of this DM guide that they give you both a verbal and graphical explanation of how linear and Gaussian distributions differ depending on how you roll your dice. I love that.
Yeah, that's why it's almost, you know, if we would have had first edition in front of us when we first started this gaming, not even podcasting, gaming, I think we would have very well gotten stuck in first edition. You know, I promise Jason, because I tend to do this, not flip pages while I'm mic'd up and talking, but I'm going to break the rule, Jason. So you're going to hear some page flipping and you can yell at me afterwards. But I'm just looking in here and looking at tables like psionic versus mental comp. I mean, it's just detection of visibility cables. Again, I'm being a little hyper high end to it, but the narrative in the book, in the DM guide, isn't as strong as discussion of how the gameplay mechanic works.
Quick
And I think that's what's, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, quick counterpoint to that. I definitely agree. Just the example you gave, another thing that stands out is part of that complexity, stands out to me, is that so many of the ideas that we still find in 5e, like, you know me, one of my favorites, the whole reason I even bought Tasha's Cauldron in 5e was because I wanted the psionics rules. Just the fact that almost all of that hails back to 1e kind of gives me a sense of just how complex this sucker is.
Yeah, I mean, as I look through the book, now I'm going to close it so you don't hear the pages flipping. It again, I love this about the game. Some people might not. They love 5e more because there's less of it. It is a true encyclopedia. The Dungeon Master's Guide is. And it really gives you an idea. The player's guide is great, don't get me wrong, but the DM guide really gives you into the mind of what Gygax and the folks that helped him were looking at with this, and what their mindset was. To your point, it was very statistically oriented. He was a war gamer before he got into fantasy gaming, right? So
yeah, and it shows.
Yeah, and it shows. I mean, this is, in effect, he took his wargaming expertise and background and applied it into a fantasy world. And I know many of you can speak more. I'm looking at this purely from, you could argue that I'm speaking at this from as someone who's not an expert in 1E. I'm not. We're both looking at this from purely almost an outsider looking in type of view because we weren't playing at this time. And remember, second edition came out in '89. Which would have been well into our teenage years.
Yeah, I mean, in all fairness, we were learning to walk when 1E came out. So just to put it in perspective.
Yeah, and when 2E came out, we were busy with other things, other games. At that point, you probably were starting up on the D6 Star Wars. Just when I go back and I read this now, I don't know if I would have gotten into this when I was younger as much as I would now.
Honestly, the fact that it's all about monsters and fantasy, Brad, would have turned me away. I mean, obviously, I've always been you've always, I think, been more liberal between the two of us in terms of your imagination space, if you will. Whereas I've always defaulted to sci-fi. And this I would have loved playing, I'm sure, but the focus, like the monster manual, like when you pushed and shoved me into Pathfinder, I struggled with just how monster oriented and nasty in a neat way it can be. One of the things I like about 5e is that it kind of puts that in perspective, and you can have as much or as little. So I agree with you. I think as a kid, I would have been turned off a little bit by the crunchiness and the lack of clarity, unless I had someone who knew how to play really well, like I did with the D6 Star Wars from West End Games. And I think the whole fantasy monster stuff, right? Because like you said, this was when people still read Lord of the Rings. You couldn't watch it.
And again, I want to be careful, like you had indicated, of copyright, but I'm looking at like page 7. It says right there, right here, Swords and Sorcery best describes what this game is about. As a role player, you become Falstaff the fighter. He is making it abundantly clear that this is a fantasy world. The player's handbook is purely for the player. If you were going to play this game, the mechanic to me is obviously, you can see the ancestry of D&D even through version 5. But if you go back to version 1, you can almost see like how Pathfinder as a fork before version 4 came out really had kind of in my mind, again, this is opinion, true first edition ancestry, just better written because they had time to refine.
Yeah, like just with one E here, and I'm trying not to flip through the pages. Um, but just how molecular the guidance is at that level of detail. How, like you said, there are charts, lists, tables, mostly lists and tables for, I mean, so here, page 27, just because I randomly flipped here. Values of other rare commodities. Furs. And then they list the following types: beaver, ermine, fox, marlin, mink, muskrat, sable, seal. And then there are data for pelt, trimming, collar, cuffs, edges, caper jacket, and then the suggested cost. I mean, let's be honest, most of us couldn't even differentiate some of those animals, much less weave them into DMing.
Jason, you're a teacher. I am not. But I'm looking at pages 68 and forward, and I look at like pursuit and evasion in outdoor settings. And instead of talking about dice rolls and so on, best chance of evading pursuit outdoors is 80%. If the pursued is faster, it's 10%. If both parties are of equal speed, it's 0%. And then it shows actually the different hex charts or square charts of flanking, rear, front, and so on. It's so detailed. I understand now, and I have to read this again. I understand now why people say it's still a good read, because it really is like an encyclopedia. I know there is a I cannot remember the term. I can't remember the actual name of the book, but it is an encyclopedia that merges all of the red box levels 1 through 36 together into one omnipedia. I think it may be the term that they use. I just look at the percentages, and it talks about percentages rather than just purely dice rolls and narrative. Even though it's different now, the game has obviously changed over time, morphed. Just the detail involved. Go ahead, Jay. Just the detail is fascinating.
Yeah, well, and I think, no, I agree strongly. And I think, whereas we don't see this with 5e, or honestly, I would imagine a number of, like, certainly not with 3.5e that became Pathfinder. I think if we look with a psychological lens, like so many of the examples of what you just described, it's almost like Gygax is writing for an internal crowd, if you will. Like, I think if you read about him and read about he and Arneson and whatnot, my impression is, going through the DM guide, and I assume the others you have as well, Brad, that we are getting an insight into his needs, his joys, his frustrations, to feel compelled to put so much effort into such minor detail. And let's face it, both of us, you and I, have on occasion been accused, even verily by our own wives, of risking bordering on the, if not rigid, let's call it pleasantly obsessive sides. And neither of us would write a manual like this. I just think it's a fascinating insight into one of the chief minds which created this whole system, this whole game, and the underlying needs behind it that, for our benefit, evolved into what eventually became just this elegant, fun mechanic.
Jason and I tend to record without cameras on from bandwidth perspectives, and I was going to jump in before, but I had to stop laughing because I started when you said about our wives bordering on the obsessive. I think, yes, that's true in different ways, but yes, sitting and reading books about a game that we aren't necessarily going to play tomorrow qualifies. And I am going to have to read, as much as I don't, I need to spend more time with 5th edition material these days, just because I need to get us back, and Jason and I and the group back into the groove again of playing.
Yeah, I've actually been meaning to talk to you about that. We've been so focused on having fun recording that
Yeah,
I'm getting
we
the
actually
itch to
we
play.
actually have to. Yeah, I've been having an itch to play with five and reading through this first edition material only increased that need to go back and play. But reading through this, and I think it's going to weave into our future discussions. This material, you know, I mean, it goes right into like, it talks about keeping careful track of time, you know. One thing stressed, I'm just looking at page 37 quick. One thing stressed in the original game was the importance of recording game time. In AD&D, it's emphasized more. You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. I don't think maybe I missed it, but I don't think we're talking about that in 5th edition.
I don't think you and I are capable of keeping strict time on anything.
Free flowing. No, I mean, if you and I didn't have an internal clock and we weren't actually, before we start recording, talk about based off of the current clock time when we're going to move from topic to GM corner, I think you could get a episode that would rival the Star Trek one, if not longer. So I had wanted to dig even a little deeper to, I think this becomes more of the fact that, you know, now two middle-aged men looking back at the game, looking at the game we play now and looking at its birth, I have a newfound respect for how the game has changed over time as it's moved between owners, as people who are prominent voices in the gaming world have helped drive it forward. All the testing that was done. I know there was a lot of pre-test launch of material for version 4. There was pre-test launch for version 5, especially so. You know, this was written, like you said, for an internal crowd. The stuff now is written for mass market. The one show you didn't mention before that got a lot of people's attention about Dungeons and Dragons is Stranger Things. Yeah. Yep. I bought my daughter, who would probably be close to last in line to wanting to play a game with me. I got her the red box Stranger Things set because it had a figurine of it in there that she was interested in, and she's looked at the material. It comes with the characters that the actor characters play in the game, so it is the character's character, and she's actually pondered the idea. She said no to me about playing. So I bring this up because Jason probably hasn't even heard this yet. There may be a chance for us to play some original Dungeons and Dragons at some point in the future, if my daughter isn't just being courteous to me and not being blunt.
Time will tell, but that's pretty sweet. I think actually that's a beautiful stopping point for us to transition over to the GM corner. As we do, listeners, I think we should probably explain two related phenomena, or at least a comment and a phenomenon. A few minutes ago, Brad explained that we typically record with our video muted. It's probably worth noting for those of you who are particularly curious or caught that comment, that it's not that Brad and I find each other morally or visually repugnant, not yet. The fact is that I am, as of this recording, still running on what can only be called in technical terms an ancient router. And I have had for the past 16, 18 months of pandemic, which hopefully will finally be over by the time you hear this episode. I've had a lot of bandwidth issues, even though I have fiber optic running into the house. So we do that not because we are offensive to one another, although that is almost certainly true, but because I have an ancient router. I also then want to apologize. Brad is probably not even aware of it on his end, but there are a few audio glitches in our recording this time. C'est la vie. The next episode, I will be running at the speed of God with my new router system, my new mesh. So we'll be able to see each other again, Brad. On that maybe good or bad note, GM Corner, what have you been reading, doing, thinking, playing that you want to bring up?
I'm gonna steal a little thunder from you because we talked about it this week. This idea, first edition, is going to remain on my desk here. And I'm going to continue to work through it just because, as someone who is a new DM, leading a gamers who have really never played before, we're all learning together. So I think this first edition material, is phenomenal for me as a new DM, just more insight. The other one where I am potentially stealing all thunder is if we were to take Star Trek and modify it into a different gaming system. I'm not going to give anything away because we still haven't made any decisions on that yet. But you and I have talked about it, and we're reading through again the Genesis core rulebook, just because this idea of us playing a fantasy game in the D20 world. We have Star Wars in the narrative system. And for those if you haven't listened to our Star Trek episodes, especially the last one, the Omni episode, please do, because you'll hear the passion for it. I believe we've talked about Fate, we've talked about Genesis, there's even Savage Worlds, there's other, GURPS, you can go back to GURPS. I'm really feeling this vibe for what it would be like to build some sort of Star Trek game. We'd have to determine the depth. Using Genesis, I think it's one of all the corporate shakeup and maneuvering was to release the narrative system in an open form that allowed it to be modified. And if you go out to the what was it called, Jason? The factory. I can't remember the name of it at the time for Genesis.
It's just here in town, Fantasy Flight Games.
No, but they had like a Genesis factory or something.
The Genesis Foundry.
Foundry, thank you. There is so much material out there for so many different games. Someone's modified Firefly, someone's modified Terminator. There are even some attempts at looking at Star Trek. In that, I think honestly, them providing us a narrative system that isn't necessarily tied. They have Terranoth and they have some stuff that you can play with it, or Android, all great material, but they leave it open to us to use it as we see fit. And I'm feeling more and more like Star Trek really could fit that, with no disrespect to the Star Trek Adventure series. I love it. I have all the material. Jason and I just talked about the game. But my budding passion for the narrative system, thanks to Jason, and Star Trek, it's culminating.
Yeah, and boy, yes, you totally stole my thunder, which is great. As you know, my wife and girls and I are in a couple days going to take a brief family trip, the first since the start of the pandemic, and we'll see. I'm actually thinking of bringing my Genesis core rule book with me for exactly the same purpose. I know you and I have chatted a bit about it, and I have some mental notes of how I think, some mental notes of how I think the PC sheet could look in terms of just some finer points. And so I think I'm probably going to bring that with me to have in the background as a backup if I have some quiet moments, some morning or evening. And we'll just to wander, and we'll just keep teasing this for our listeners until we actually do something with that. Everyone, thanks as always for listening. Please make sure to check us out at diceinmind.com. Follow us on social media, which is primarily Facebook and Instagram. Please follow, subscribe, like the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you pod your casts. And
Okay,
one
so
more time.
before you
Go ahead.
before you wrap up, I just want to make mention. We've started seeing a lot of traffic from friends and listeners through Instagram. So
Check
and
us out.
Facebook as well, but especially Instagram, because obviously, please do. If you have, I'm going to actually be posting some pictures this week of my continued collection. I think I better post them on Instagram versus Facebook. Otherwise I get more questions from my wife as to why I have so many books.
That's funny, because I was going to do the same thing on Facebook.
Yeah. So yeah, I already got it. So that's why you'll see more of this on Instagram now. And so I'm going to be posting some of my collection out there related to D&D, especially. So yeah, check us out. I see a lot of interest growing on Instagram, fellow podcasters and so on. And both of us really appreciate it. Come and see us. If you have anything you want to add, pictures or anything related to it, spread the word. Sorry, Jace. I just wanted to make mention because it's just been,
Thanks,
it's
Brad.
been, it's.
No, that's great. And just listeners, once more, our apologies for the sound quality this one time. This is what happens when you've been using a decade-old router for more than a year. Next recording, we promise we will be grease lightning once again. And before Brad can make a joke about that, we're going to wish you all well. Stay healthy, stay safe, keep playing. We will see you next time on Dice in Mind.